Buju Matake Yape. Greetings, students. This is the Media Center with another book to share with you, The Legend of Minnesota. But before I do that, I would like to share with you a land acknowledgement for Minnesota. I want you to know that Minnesota is the birthplace for the Dakota, and it's where Bedote, where the Mississippi and the Minnesota River meet. We reside on land that was cared for and called home by the Dakota, the Ojibwa, and the Northern Cheyenne people and other native peoples from time immemorial. This land holds great historical, spiritual, and personal significance for its original stewards, the native nations and the people of this region. I want to recognize that continuously supports Buju Matake Yape. Greetings, students. This is the Library Media Center with another great book for you, The Legend of Minnesota. But before we share this book, I would like to share with you an Indigenous land acknowledgement. Because this land that we live on is the ancestral homeland of the Dakota, the Ojibwa, Ho-Chunk, Cheyenne, Oto, Iowa, and Mescowee people. And Minnesota is home to 11 distinct tribal nations. Across this state of Minnesota, there remains 4 federally recognized Dakota tribal Oyate, or nations: the Shakopee Mdewakanton Prairie Island Community, the Upper Sioux Community, and the Lower Sioux Community. Minnesota is the birthplace for the Dakota, with Bedote, where the Mississippi and Minnesota River meet. Bedote area consists of many areas of historic and contemporary Dakota significance, such as Wakan Teepee and Minisni and the Owate Pilot Knob. I want you to recognize that we reside on land that was cared for and called home by the Dakota, Ojibwe, and Northern Cheyenne people and other native peoples from time immemorial. This land holds great historic, spiritual, and personal significance for its original stewards, the native nations and the people of this nation. And so by offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm tribal sovereignty, and we will all work to hold all of Minnesota accountable to native peoples and nations. And so let's begin The Legend of Minnesota. Our title page, Legend of Minnesota, written by Kathy Jo Wargin and illustrated by David Geister. When you borrow this book, you can read a little bit about the legend of Minnesota, but it's basically the author discovered old versions of a legend titled Mahamusatya, published in 1893, and it's a collection of Minnesota legends. And so she began to research other versions of the tale, and this is what she came up with. Long ago in the land of lakes, where pine-wrapped bays made half-moon shapes among ancient rocky vales, was one lake known to all. As dark and deep as the moonless night, it became a sea of yellow and orange with every setting sun, and it was so named for its color, vermilion. Beyond this lake was a mountain, grim and gray and sacred, where the riches of time not yet discovered, the ore of iron, lay quietly stowed and waiting. To its people, the Ojibwa, the land was an abundant place. There were blueberries to pick and fish to spear, grains of wild rice to harvest, and maple sap to boil into hard cakes of sugar. It was a time of plenty, but it was not a time of peace. The Ojibwa were at war with the Dakota, and the two tribes had not seen calm in many years. One night, as the harvest moon poured its gold upon the mountain, the Ojibwa chief called a meeting. The time had come to light a fire to honor a departed loved one, long buried upon the gray mountain not far beyond. This was a task of honor, and the people listened carefully to the chief's request. But when the chief finished speaking, nobody rose to accept the duty. They were weak from skirmishes with the Dakota and wary of the danger this task would pose. If one of them were discovered while making the journey, the Dakota would learn from their camp, and misfortune might follow. The air was stone-cold quiet, except for the snap of the fire and the rustle of embers. The silence drew heavy upon them until a young girl stepped forward through the smoke. Her name was Morning Fawn, and as she looked at the chief, she said, "I will do this." A milk-white falcon flew low over her head, skimming many times to circle above her. To all, it was a sign that fate had chosen her for this dangerous task. At dawn, Morning Fawn followed a footpath into the woods. She stepped across a slow-moving stream where bald eagles made great nests in pine trees above her. She walked beside ponds where yellow and white water lilies rested upon the surface like night stars that had fallen from the sky. She rested among stands of white birch and balsam poplar, and then walked along the path that became a soft carpet of aged pine needles broken by knotted cedar roots and twisted their way across the forest floor. As Morning Fawn reached the sacred place, she felt at peace with her task and prepared for her fate. She carefully lit the flame and bowed her head. Now it was time to make the journey home. As she made her way through the woods, she saw a young Dakota brave lying upon the ground. At first, Morning Fawn stood as still and silent as a mother deer hiding her young in an open meadow. But when her eyes met his, she could tell that he was very ill and did not have long to live. Pale and weak, he was warm to the touch. Morning Fawn made him a bed out of leaves and started a fire to cook some broth. He lay there quietly as she stroked his hair with a friendly touch. And although barely able to speak, he told her an old healing secret. Doing as he said, Morning Fawn gathered the root of the balsam poplar and carefully made a special medicine for him. Morning Fawn remained with the Dakota brave for 3 days and 3 nights, and with her help he grew stronger and was no longer pale. During this time he told her of his home where bright meadows went sweeping toward the sun, and she told him of the shady granite resting spots near the edge of the red-stained lake. He sang to her about the shaggy bison and the great thunder they made during the hunt, and she motioned upward to describe the dancing skies and how bands of blue and green and pink seemed to flash in the night. They laughed often and liked each other very much, but deep inside Morning Fawn knew that they would not be able to remain together. Until their bands were no longer enemies, such a friendship would not be allowed. Back in the village there was great worry when Morning Fawn did not return after the sacred fire was lit. 2 braves went to find her and came upon Morning Fawn with the Dakota brave. Worried that the boy might tell his tribe about the Ojibwa camp, they quickly took him prisoner. When they reached the village, the boy was set apart from the others. He was lonely, he was frightened, and Morning Fawn wanted to help him. That night, when the last fire cooled and the village was sleeping, Morning Fawn set him free. The pair slipped away quietly into the forest to a stand of balsam poplar, and then, as the dusky moon cast shadows upon their faces, Morning Fawn told him to go away. But the Dakota boy did not understand. He did not want to leave his friend. She had saved his life, and he wanted to be with her always. Morning Fawn did not want to harm to come his way, so she insisted he leave. Still, he did not understand. He begged to stay while she kept telling him to go away. With tears in his eyes, he asked her to live with him upon the prairie, but Morning Fawn refused. Dawn was breaking, and she was worried that he might be discovered. At last, Morning Fawn knew of only one way to make him go home. And although she cared for him very much, Morning Fawn told him otherwise and ordered him to leave. When the others had learned that Morning Fawn had let the boy free, they could not look in her direction or speak to her. This went on for days and weeks, and Morning Fawn felt sad and alone. Soon a terrible sickness fell upon the village. People lay on their beds moaning with pain and fever, and no cure was known. Morning Fawn watched as people were fading into a weak and weary sleep. And then she remembered the secret the Dakota boy had shared. Doing as he had taught her, she gathered the root of the balsam poplar and made the healing balm, and then went from bed to bed. One by one the sick began to feel better, and others who lay waiting began to call out for her. Mahanusatiya, Mahanusatiya, they called, for this was the name by which they knew the balsam poplar. For many days the sick people kept calling out to her, and in time she was able to help them all. So in the spirit of their renewed love for her, they renamed her Mahanusatiya, and all was forgiven. The time came for the Ojibwa to move their camp, and when they did, Mahanusatiya stayed behind, remaining beneath the balsam poplar. Every evening she sang her farewell to the Dakota boy, and her words carry high upon the wind and throughout the lands. Each year, as her people passed the balsam poplar, they would call out to her, Mahanusatiya, Mahanusatiya, as a sign of great respect. Years passed, and Mahanusatiya grew old and small, withered deep into the earth itself. And since that time, generations still call out her name when they pass the balsam poplar, the name chosen to address the beautiful land that lay west of the great unsalted sea. And as it came to be spoken in new accents and languages through time, we still hear her name today, known throughout the world, in the hearts of those who will love her always. Minnesota, Minnesota. And here's a little bit of information about the author and the illustrator. I hope you enjoyed this book, The Legend of Minnesota.